Hello again, welcome back to the Meeting Point English, and in today's lesson we will be looking at the difference between must and have to. Now both of these are used to talk about obligations, and there is a small difference. If you look in your grammar book, you will notice that it says must is used for the internal obligation, whereas have to is used for what they call the external obligation. Now, what does this mean, I hear you ask? Well, there is a general tendency that if the speaker is responsible for the obligation, they tend to use must more often. And people use have to when the obligation is coming from another person or from society in general. So let me give you some examples to illustrate this. I could say, I must get up early tomorrow. Now, in this situation, if I use must, the implication here is that the obligation is coming from me, the speaker. So imagine I've seen the weather and I know it's going to be a beautiful day, and my intention is to spend the day out in the mountains exploring. I'm going to get up early, make my lunch, take my sandwiches up the mountain with me and have a good day out. So the obligation is not coming from anyone else. It is purely my own obligation upon myself. So I say I must get up early tomorrow. This is me telling me to get up early tomorrow, not anybody else. Now, if somebody said this sentence, I have to get up early tomorrow, it would imply that the obligation is coming from another person. So maybe you have to travel to another city and there is a train or plane leaving at a certain time. And there is an obligation of timetables, which means you have to get up early tomorrow. Or maybe you've got a meeting with your boss in the morning, or you're going to the dentist, or you're going somewhere before you go to work. So you might say, I have to get up early tomorrow. And of course, like many things in English grammar, this is really a tendency rather than a rule that we have to obey. Okay, we tend to use must when the speaker is giving the obligation, have to when the obligation is coming from another place. Here are some more examples. You must do your homework. This is a teacher talking to the students. You must do your homework. Or maybe it's a parent talking to a child. But the obligation, you see, is coming from the person who is speaking. Whereas the child or the student might say, I have to do my homework. In this case, this obligation is seen as coming from someone else. The parent or the teacher is making them do it. So they would say, I have to do my homework. You have to stop at a red light. You have to pay your taxes. You see, in both of these examples, the obligation is coming from the rules of society in general. And as there are a lot more cases where other people tell us what to do rather than our personal obligations, you will find that have to is a lot more common than must in most conversations. Now, if you get these mixed up and you say you must pay your taxes, it's not completely wrong. It sounds a bit like you, the speaker, is telling somebody to pay their taxes, whereas really the obligation is from society. So have to would sound more correct. But again, it's a tendency that people use them in this way rather than obeying any grammatical rule. So I hear you ask, what about obligations in the past? Now, how do we talk about these obligations when we're talking about the past? Well, the problem with modal auxiliary verbs like must is that they don't transfer into the past very well. So we tend to use the past tense of have to, which would be had to. So here are some example sentences. I had to buy a new shirt. They had to pay a parking fine. She had to go to hospital. So you can see from these examples that it doesn't really matter where the obligation is coming from in the past. When we're talking in the present, there is a difference between the internal and external obligations. When we're talking about the past, we only use had to. Okay, the must does not transfer into the past, so whatever the obligation in the past, we can use had to. Now, let's talk about mustn't and don't have to. So we looked at must and have to. Now we need to look at these negative forms. The first thing to notice is must not, often seen contracted to mustn't. We don't always pronounce the middle T there, mustn't. And it's a very strange spelling, which a lot of people make a mistake with this spelling, but it's M-U-S-T-N''T. And don't have to. You see, have to, even though we use it as a modal auxiliary verb, it doesn't possess the same qualities as a complete modal auxiliary verb. So to make have to negative, we're using the auxiliary do, in this case don't, because it's negative. So the opposite of have to is not haven't to. The opposite is don't have to. You need the don't auxiliary there to make it negative. So mustn't and don't have to. Okay, when they were positive, must and have to were very similar. The only difference was the internal-external obligation. When they go negative, they really are quite different. You will see that the mustn't is used to indicate a prohibition, whereas don't have to only says that there is no obligation. Okay, there's have to is the obligation. Don't have to tells you there is no obligation. Now let me put these in some sentences. You mustn't hit your brother. Okay, this is the mother talking to child. You mustn't hit your brother. It is a bad thing to do. It is one of the rules of the house. You do not hit your brother. So you mustn't. It is prohibited to hit your brother. You don't have to wear a tie. Okay, you're going to work in an office. If you want to wear a tie, you can. But don't have to only says that there is no obligation. It's not the same as you mustn't wear a tie. That would be a prohibition. So you don't have to wear a tie indicates no obligation to wear a tie. So what about if we want to use these in the past? We've already seen that must does not transfer into the past very well. However, if we're using don't have to, we can quite easily change don't to didn't. So we get didn't have to, again using the did as the auxiliary. We didn't have to wear a uniform at my school. Okay, so it's just like you don't have to wear a tie, but this is talking about the past. We didn't have to. And of course you cannot say hadn't. We hadn't to wear a uniform. That would not really work very well, even though you do find some very old pieces of writing where they do try this structure. But generally in modern speech we use the auxiliary didn't. We didn't have to wear a uniform at my school. So what about mustn't? If the previous one we were looking at was a lack of obligation in the past, what do we do when we want to use mustn't? Well, as I said, mustn't does not work in the past. So really we have to use some other phrases. So we can use couldn't. We couldn't wear jeans at school. We can use couldn't because we have can in the present and we use could as a past tense of can. So if you can use can for permission, then we can use couldn't for permission in the past. So we couldn't wear jeans at school. I wasn't allowed to stay out late, so you can use allowed. Or you can say they didn't let us. They didn't let us chew gum. Okay, so we can't use mustn't when talking about the past, but there are other options of other phrases we can use. So what have we looked at so far? There was must and have to, both ways of expressing obligations. Must if the obligation is coming from the speaker, and have to, which is much more common if it's coming from an external source and probably society in general. Then we looked at how to talk about it in the past, and because must does not transfer to the past, we have to use have to, changing to had to. So whatever you're talking about in the past, any past obligation, we can use had to. Then we looked at the negative forms, and mustn't is a prohibition, whereas don't have to only reflects the idea that there is no obligation. And then we looked at the past tense of don't have to being didn't have to. So lack of obligation in the past, we didn't have to wear uniform, for example. And then to put mustn't into the past, we can't really use mustn't in the past, so we use we were not allowed to, they didn't let us, or we couldn't, and expressions such as those. Well, I hope you enjoyed that and it was all clear and useful for you. Don't forget to click on the like if you enjoyed it, and subscribe, leave a comment, etc. See you in the next video.